on. Good afternoon. So pleased to be with you. I'm Anne Leonard, Manton Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Clark, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture. We were just saying that this is we're one of the first, if not the first, event to happen in the auditorium since the beginning of the pandemic, so it's a great pleasure and delight to be back together in here. And I wanted to also mention that you see that the stage has been used for some purposes. This is the various equipment involved with the row rehearsal, so if you've not seen row, please try to see it, but that explains our unusual setup today. It will not be a musical performance, in case that was a conclusion anyone had drawn. One of the great joys of working at the Clark is the constant coming and going of scholars working in all fields of art history. And this distinctive feature of our institution ensures that the intellectual environment is always fresh and stimulating. When there's overlap with exhibitions in preparation, the encounters and conversations nourish our curatorial projects and I hope makes them even better. So Carolyn Fowler, our speaker today, is head of the Research and Academic Program and thus responsible for the steady flow of visiting fellows I mentioned earlier. She manages a generous program of conferences, lectures, and symposia throughout the year, but she's also herself a scholar of early modern art, especially Dürer. So it went without saying that she should give a lecture in conjunction with Dürer and after the exhibition I organized, which is on view now in the Thaw Gallery and through October 3rd. So thank you, Caro, for accepting this invitation, especially at a time when you have more than your share of other preoccupations. Caro is a familiar figure around the Clark, but by way of formal introduction, for those of you who may not know her, she is Starr Director of the Research and Academic Program, a role she was promoted to in December 2019 after having served as Associate Director. And prior to joining the Clark, she was the Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in the Physical History of Art at Yale University, where she taught graduate seminars and coordinated workshops from 2016 to 2018. She is the author of 2 books, The Art of Paper, From the Holy Land to the Americas, from 2019, and Drawing and the Senses, An Early Modern History, from 2017. We're delighted to have her speaking with us today, and her paper is titled, as you see on the screen, Dürer and Mantania, Images en Route. So please join me in welcoming Caro to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for coming out on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. And just as a note, I am 8 months pregnant, which I only share to say that your lungs and body become very compressed. and so I tend to be a bit breathier than usual, and I tend to speak a little more slowly. So please bear with me as I speak. And thank you so much to Anne for the invitation. And this is really just an opportunity to talk to all of you about some images that I love and that I've thought about for a very long time. And I'm happy to talk about them with you afterwards. And a lot of it will just be some kind of close looking at what makes Dürer so special. And one of the things to start with, and this is one of the many reasons why it's such a great concept for an exhibition, Dürer and after, looking at his influence, is that one of the most fascinating things about Albrecht Dürer is that he was very aware in his own lifetime that he would be influential, and he actively attempted to shape his own legacy while he was alive. And so, in fact, he's often credited with being one of the first artists in the Western European world to not only actively collect his predecessors' work, but to also actually annotate their drawings. And so this is an example from the British Museum. It's a very famous example. And in the top part right up here, he actually annotated the drawing. So this is a drawing by one of Dürer's predecessors, an artist named Martin Schongauer. And Dürer collected the drawing, and he wrote at the top that it was made by Martin Schongauer, the beautiful Martin Schongauer, in the year 1469. So there are two very unusual things here. One, that Dürer actually dates the drawing, so he has a sense of kind of a timeline of artistic style and history. And he also attributes the drawing. So he attributes the drawing to Martin Schongauer. And this is very unusual. And so it's something now in the world of collecting and art history we might take for granted. But in Dürer's time, this is exceptional. So in today's lecture, instead of looking at the relationship between Albrecht Dürer and artists who followed after him, I'm going to consider an artist who preceded him and had an enormous impact on his understanding of printmaking and artistic vocabulary. And ultimately, I will argue that at the end of his life, he turned to this artist, Andrea Mantegna, who I will discuss in a little bit. He turned to Mantegna as a means to come to a certain awareness of the ways in which images extend beyond the lifetime of their makers. And so, the other artist to whom I'm going to be dedicating today's talk is another artist named Andrea Mantegna, who lived from roughly 1431 to 1506. And he's a North Italian artist. He was based in the court of Mantua, basically, working for Ludovico Gonzaga, and he was primarily a painter. But he was also incredibly important as an engraver. And there is some debate about whether or not he actually engraved his own plates. Often artists throughout this period would have other craftsmen engrave their actual plates. But Mantegna is really credited with really moving the discipline and the artistic practice of printmaking forward. And this is probably, to my mind, one of the most extraordinary images of what we might canonically call the Renaissance. And it's an engraving, and it's by Mantegna, and it's called Carrying Christ's Body to His Tomb. And this is a particularly beautiful impression of it in the National Gallery in DC. But it was a really canonical engraving, and it was incredibly formative for artists in this period. And so today, in many ways, we're going to be looking at the ways in which this composition and style of engraving impacted Dürer and had a really important influence on his own understanding of depicting Christ's passion at the end of his life. So moving forward, in the spring of 1521, Albrecht Dürer took a trip to the Low Countries. And what I'm showing you right here is actually a drawing from the Clark's collection, certainly one of the most prized works, I think, in the entire collection. And as you can see from this drawing, and this is a drawing by Dürer during his trip to the Low Countries, he was really interested in seeing new things. And so this is a drawing of primarily the animals in a menagerie. They were exotic animals and also landscapes. But he also used this trip as an opportunity to schmooze and see other artists and meet with kind of very important people and to ask for money and to sell his prints. And he also went to see art. And so the time period really prior to Dürer in Northern Europe, the real kind of flowering of art and the artists that so many people were looking towards were the artists of the generation before Dürer working in the Netherlands. So for Dürer, this pilgrimage to the Netherlands was also really an opportunity to see the work of his predecessors and to really engage with it. And it was during this trip that Dürer refers in his journal, and he kept a journal during this trip, and a lot of it is very kind of just keeping accounts of how much money he was making from selling his prints. But he does say other things. And one thing that he mentions is he says, I sketched 3 times Christ led away till Calvary and twice the Mount of Olives using 5 half sheets. And so some of these drawings survive. And so he's basically describing a series of sketches he made of Christ's Passion. And these are 2 of the drawings that survive, Christ bearing the cross, and both of these are in the Uffizi in Florence. And then he also sketched some agonies in the garden in this series, and this is one of them in Frankfurt. But then there are also drawings that scholars associate with this series that he did not directly mention in his diary. And so this is one of them. This is a Last Supper. And finally, and this will be the focus of the talk today, he made 2 drawings of carrying Christ's body to his tomb. And as mentioned, all of these compositions belong to the same kind of Passion series, and they're considered unusual because of their horizontal orientation. So it's called the Oblong Passion, and this horizontal orientation is new for Dürer. And so here I'm showing a previous version of the Passion that Dürer did in 1507, and this is a printed version as opposed to a drawn one. And as you can see here, it's a vertical orientation, and Dürer made many Passion series throughout his lifetime, and they all had a vertical orientation. So this later study of the Passion, and this is some details from it, is particular for its horizontal orientation, so that's point 1. And then it's also very unusual, and this is what we're really going to discuss today, is that Dürer is really engaging with a new kind of stylistic deployment of line that diverges really significantly from his earlier graphic work, which was often devoted to cross-hatching and chiaroscuro. And here, these kind of horizontal lines and the very kind of the very linear quality of it, the horizontality of the lines, the ways in which it's really a stripped down vocabulary of line is something very new in Dürer's graphic practice. And I'm also going to show you an example from earlier so you get a sense of what I'm talking about. So earlier in Dürer's career, and this is much earlier, this is the late 1490s, he actually made copies after Mantanias Prince. And so this is a copy that he made after a very famous Mantegna print, Battle of the Sea Gods. And you can see in the detail, so this is the Mantegna, and you can see how Mantegna had a very clear contour line. He often shaded through use of horizontal lines. There's kind of a much more pared down vocabulary of line, whereas when Dürer copied the Mantegna, he really got into cross-hatching, he really got into chiaroscuro, he really brought out a lot of detail through creating much more of a sculptural effect and really playing more with this contrast of really, really deep darks and fewer areas of kind of bringing into light. But mainly it's the cross-hatching in which he really kind of shows his virtuosity as a draftsman and as a printmaker. And so here we can see this is really a completely different style of line. As you can see, the cross-hatching is almost completely gone, and he's really just working in parallel strokes. And this is really quite different and quite new. And I'm not the first person to comment on this. And Erwin Panofsky, who's one of the most famous Dürer scholars, argued that this new type of line, this new kind of style in Dürer's work, was connected to his fascination with the writings of Martin Luther at the end of his life. And so, Martin Luther, the famous theologian who nailed, or people now say pasted, to a local notice board a treatise that would really transform the European religious landscape. Dürer was very, very influenced by his writings at the end of his life. And so Panofsky argued that this change in Dürer's draftsmanship is really a reflection of Martin Luther's writings, which are really about kind of a return to the text, a return to humility, a turning away from kind of the Baroque ostentation of the Catholic Church and all these kind of rites and rituals, and really kind of trying to strip things down to the basics. And so for Panofsky, and he writes, quote, Dürer's new art, Dürer's new style, reflects this conversion, for it was a conversion both in subject matter and style. So he really saw this new graphic language as embodied in an internal turning towards Luther's writings, and that this simplicity of execution in this line really resonated with the humilitas of the theologian. And another scholar, Jordan Cantor, also remarks that Dürer conveys kind of a distance within these drawings, that the drawings engage with Luther's reform because they make a new understanding of the Passion that was about a way to depict presence without making images that themselves had presence. And so you might ask, what does it mean to make an image that depicts presence without actually having presence? So to get a sense of that, we can turn to one of the most iconic paintings of the Passion, and this is Roger van der Weyden's Descent from the Cross. It's in the Prado in Madrid. It's worth the trip. It's extraordinary. And one of the most famous interpretations of this painting argues, and you can see how the sway of the Virgin's body here mirrors the sway of her son's. And the interpretation of this painting, which is pretty well accepted, is that essentially the Virgin's grief models the kind of emulation that the viewer should be experiencing as well. So just as the Virgin is kind of fainting and knocked unconscious and physically within her body mirroring the bodily taking down of her son from the cross, that this kind of emulation, this kind of physical effect should be mirrored within the viewer as well, and that the viewer should really experience this same kind of rhythmic emulation of grief within the lamentation for Christ. And the painting really entreats viewers to move their inner selves, to stir their inward passions. Luther took a very different stance to this, and he argued very differently that in fact the viewer should not over-identify with the grief of the Virgin and her fellow mourners. So, and this is actually the treatise in which he makes that argument, which we know that Albrecht Dürer owned. And this is, as you can see, the printer who made this treatise clearly took this image from Dürer's own canon. And this treatise came out in many different editions, and all of them have kind of a Dürer woodcut on the cover. So in this treatise, Luther really writes against those who over-identify with the grief and mourning of the Virgin. And he writes, quote, "Some feel pity for Christ, lamenting and bewailing his innocence." Here we actually have the quote here. And they're like women who followed Christ from Jerusalem and were chided and told by Christ that it would be better to weep for themselves and their children. They are the kind of people who go far afield in their meditation on the Passion, making much of Christ's farewell from Bethany and of the Virgin Mary's anguish, but never progressing beyond that, which is why so many hours are devoted to the contemplation of Christ's Passion. So in this widely circulated treatise, Luther is really articulating a relationship to the Passion that is not like that we saw in the Roger van der Weyden painting, but which is really an absorption in the affect of the Passion and the feeling of that. But instead, he's really arguing that you need to acknowledge the expanse between Christ and yourself. And he argues that really the only atonement that exists in Christ's death and resurrection, and that there's in fact this giant abyss between oneself and one's Christ that isn't bridged by one's own passionate feelings, but is actually really only bridged by Christ's love. And so in this, the goal is not to collapse the worlds between the imagined and the lived, but to realize the space between the representation and one's own contemporaneous time. And so in many ways, Dürer's drawings of the Oblong Passion, and I will discuss this further, is in fact this grappling with realizing the distance between one's own historical time and the time of the Passion. And one way in which Dürer really did this and really engaged with this, and this is something else that Erwin Panofsky realized, is that he turned to the artist Andrea Mantegna. And as you can see in this slide here, in the composition, you can really see the ways in which Dürer is thinking about this composition here in terms of the carrying of Christ's body. And the quote on the screen is a quote by Erwin Panofsky and discussing the ways in which Dürer is really turning to Mantegna to think about how to depict the Passion. And what Panofsky notes, which is true, is Dürer really develops kind of a lapidary dimension in his work. There becomes this new stone-like quality. And so as Panofsky wrote, all this combined with a certain rock-like quality in the interpretation of organic forms and landscape features, establishing a similarity between Dürer's late pen drawings and the graphic works of Andrea Mantegna. In certain cases, there are direct reminiscences, and the same Dürer who in his youth had greeted Mantegna as a guide to pagan sensuousness and violence, which you can remember from that battle of the sea gods that we saw, now turned to him for this really kind of rigid relief-like formality. So although this relief-like formality pervades the Oblong Passion, it's really in the compositional studies that Dürer demonstrates his reckoning with Mantegna's composition and graphic style. For Dürer's engagement with depicting the temporal period between Christ's deposition and entombment was really focusing on the carrying of Christ's body, and he's really indebted to Mantegna in terms of thinking this through. And what's also important to realize about this central composition in Renaissance art is that this passage is imagined by artists. So in general, Christ's burial in the Bible is always pretty terse, like much of the Passion narrative. So for example, when Mark writes about Christ's burial, he writes, quote, "And he," meaning Joseph of Arimathea, "bought fine linen, took him down, wrapped him in the linen, laid him in the sepulchre, which was hewn out of a rock, and rolled a stone unto the door of the sepulchre." Similarly, Matthew says, quote, "When Joseph had taken down the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen and cloth, laid it in the new tomb, which he had hewn out of rock, and rolled a large stone against the door." John is also quite sparse. He says, "And there came also Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night and brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds in weight, and then took the body of Jesus, wound it in linen cloths with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. And now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never a man yet laid." So, as you can see in these gospel accounts on the preparation of Christ's body for the burial, they attend to where he was placed. They make clear that there was not a tomb prepared. And they also do, some of them discuss the role of witnesses. So for example, Luke says, "And the women who had come with him from Galilee followed after, and they observed the tomb and how his body was laid." And so as you can see in all of these succinct accounts, there's no actual discussing of the carrying of Christ's body, right? The carrying of Christ's body to his tomb. And this is really what Mantegna and Dürer are focusing on here and really thinking about, is the carrying of Christ's body. And there are some wonderful, as you can see here, we really see this figure here pulling back as they're really thinking about the weight of Christ's body, the ways in which the shroud really holds it. And again, here, this figure here is really thinking about containing the body within the shroud and moving backwards into the tomb. And so there's a way in which these images of carrying Christ's body are really thinking about the physicality of what it means to carry and to bury a body. And again, looking closely at the Mantegna engraving, we can see here, and this figure here is probably one of the most iconic figures in Renaissance art. She's consistently and constantly cited. We can see the Magdalene. This is the Magdalene right here. You can see how she's in this really affective motion of mourning, and her hair and drapery really crest above her, expressing her grief and emotion. While in turn, the Virgin here is really rendered lifeless as a corpse. And these are really two different forms of grief and mourning, kind of the over-the-top Magdalene mourning versus the utter emotional collapse of the Virgin. And we can see here how Joseph of Arimathea really bridges the composition, and he's really kind of this impassive figure in the middle, turning away from the affect of the Magdalene to really the exhausted grief of the Virgin. And in some ways, his emotional stance, pictured in the center, offers a model of emotional distance to the viewer. And in turn, Joseph watches the other members of the burial party grieve as he carries the body. And in turn, there's this landscape, there's this wonderful rocky landscape that the Passion is in. And through this landscape, Mantegna really instills the scene with a geological petrification of time and kind of the terrain that culminates in Christ's tomb, in this hewn tomb within the stone. And in turn, there's also this inscription here, which reads, to the Redeemer of the human race. And so the words facing out to the viewer really establish the resolution of the image beyond the print, and so that viewers are caught in many ways like Christ's corpse himself in transit. So viewers are really caught between their own temporal moment and the promise of future redemption through Christ's sacrifice. Yet with this lapidary address, with this kind of to the Redeemer of the human race, Mantegna also offers a final destination for the print, kind of a resolution for the print, which is beyond his own graphic capabilities, and it's within Christ's sacrifice. It's also important to note, again, this is the print again, it's also important to note that Dürer did make these drawings while traveling in the Low Countries, and scholars have postulated that Roger van der Weyden, who we discussed a little earlier, in fact also had his own painting of Christ's body being carried to the tomb in Bruges. The painting no longer exists, but this is a drawn copy after the painting. This copy is in the Louvre. And so there is some possibility that Dürer also saw that painting when he was in Bruges in the Low Countries, and scholars have also postulated that this Roger van der Weyden copy influenced Mantegna at some point in his career. And so Mantegna likely would have seen it. Usually these kind of compositions traveled among traveling artisans and artists in various drawings and study books. So essentially, we can see how in Dürer's engagement with carrying Christ's body to his tomb, he explicates the complicated relationship between a Northern and an Italian Renaissance, which are often, I mean, for those who are art historians, these fields are usually kept quite separate. And in this single composition, Dürer is really thinking about the legacy likely of two painters, not only Mantegna, but also Roger van der Weyden. And his studies in transit, Dürer's drawings of carrying Christ's body to his tomb really embody the movement not only of Christ's body, but also, I would argue, of images, and really thinking about the ways in which images travel as well. And so it's important that he created these sketches during a journey around the Low Countries, that he created them as he was seeing new site-specific paintings, such as Roger's Chapel in Bruges, yet it also gave him the opportunity to personally disseminate his own engravings and woodcuts, etc. And so in many ways, when he was making this series, Dürer was therefore himself working within the liminal spaces of transit and observing how both locality influenced artistic production while also remaining porous to foreign influence in the transit of images. So Dürer's Nuremberg composition is in many ways, I would argue, not only a study in the Passion, but also a study in the history of images and thinking about through this history of images. So we can see here, and I've highlighted some of the details, but we can see here how this central figure with his torqued body is very similar to the central figure with the torqued body in the Roger van der Weyden composition. And here we see the grief of the Magdalene with her raised hands. And in typical kind of Dürer fashion, he cites this very kind of subtly in this background. We can see these raised hands among the procession of the mourners, and we can see similarly this very kind of northern rendition of the mourning figure right here, a very Burgundian rendition of mourning. So we can see within this image the ways in which Dürer is really thinking through the previous canonical images of carrying Christ's body to his tomb and really citing them. And then in this one, Dürer really moves the viewer back a little further, and we can see how in this one he really thinks about placing the figure of the Magdalene within the center of the composition, and we see the mourners talking amongst themselves, kind of a scene that always makes me think of Eliot's quote, T.S. Eliot's quote about the women come and go talking of Michelangelo, but there is kind of this sense of kind of the daily activity of burial as opposed to that more expansive rendition of grief that we've seen in some of the other accounts. So, but ultimately, it's really in this line, it's really in this paralleled line, and it's really in this particularity of line and this kind of stone-like lapidary style that Dürer is really thinking about his relationship to Mantegna. And it's not only contemporary or somewhat contemporary 20th century scholars like Panofsky who noted the relationship between Mantegna and Dürer. So within their own lifetimes, Mantegna's and Dürer's contemporaries also discussed a relationship between the two artists. And Mantegna was in fact often somewhat criticized for having this very geological, this very rock-like line. And so, for example, there was a scholar, Camerarius, who was discussing the relationship between Dürer and Mantegna. And he describes Mantegna's style as having, quote, a certain severity and discipline, a praise for which he first earned while he excavated statues and set them up as models for his art. And so one important thing to realize about Mantegna, of course, is that he is working in this Renaissance period in which the artists really are looking back at classical and antique statuary as a means to think about the human form. But Camerarius really faults Mantegna for this, and he says, all his pieces are hard and stiff for his hand not being trained to pursue the awareness and spontaneity of the mind. Yet he still says, nothing is better or more accomplished in terms of technique. So although Mantegna is seen as having this really hardness of style, he's also seen as having a technique unlike any of his contemporaries. And his technique is really, and his style is really correlated to his own work in excavation of antique statuary. And it's argued that he really, in excavating statues, he really translated this quality of stone into engraving. And then he discusses the relationship between Mantegna and Dürer. And so there's this very famous account that he gives. And so he says, so when he, Mantegna, fell ill at Mantua and had heard that Albrecht was in Italy, he arranged for him to be summoned swiftly to meet him in order to reinforce Dürer's facility and sureness of hand with his own acquaintance with science and technique. For he had complained quite often in conversation with his friends, either that the skill of Albrecht had not come his way, or that his own knowledge, and he uses this very specific word here, scientia, had not got through to Albrecht. So when he received the message, Albrecht wasted no time, canceled all engagements, and immediately packed for the journey. But Andreas had died before Albrecht could reach Mantua, and he, meaning Dürer, often said that nothing saddened him more in all his life. For although Albrecht, Dürer, was the highest of the high, he always yearned in his magnificent and exalted mind for something higher still. So again, the important takeaway from this passage is that Camerarius says that there was a certain knowledge, a certain scientia in the work of Mantegna which had not got through to Albrecht. And with scientia, Camerarius is really ascribing to Mantegna the apex of intellectual achievement. And so in this period, there's a division between ars and scientia, what we might translate today as art and science. But ars really meant technique. It really meant kind of artisanal, physical technique. Whereas scientia really signified grasping a form that is a higher learning, that's really an intellectual, kind of almost divine grasping of form. And so what Camerarius is saying in this paragraph is that Mantegna saw that Dürer had wonderful manual skill and art. He was very technically skilled, and yet he hadn't quite realized this higher intellectual form. And in the narrative, Camerarius also implies that Dürer himself felt that he had not quite realized this higher intellectual form, and it's one reason why he wanted to meet with Mantegna. Yet I would argue that with his final Oblong Passion, Dürer shows little interest in the ostentatious technical and really kind of flourishing of technique that we see in his earlier work. And instead, he's really distilling his draftsmanship down to the kind of the simplicity of form. And I would argue that in doing this, Dürer is in fact revealing his grasp of scientia, his grasp of kind of intellectual divine form over technical facility. And so there's also really interesting things that he does with this composition. And I would also argue that in these final compositions, Dürer is really playing with the ways in which bodies can shift in space, the ways in which bodies can torque and turn in different perspectives, and that in doing this, Dürer is really making clear his own perspectives and the ways in which, as a draftsman, what he's doing is he's shifting the bodies in procession in space so that it accords to his vision, and that in this ability to easily shift and move bodies in space, he's expressing his own grasp of scientia. So, in employing Mantegna's really austere graphic style, Dürer conveys that this model of draftsmanship is the mode by which to articulate scientia, the mode by which to articulate this higher grasp of form. Mantegna's own linear work presented the process of translation from antique statuary to copperplate engraving, although he never transcended the kind of antique qualities of the statue. And so in making evident this process of transformation, his debt to both antiquity and also the stone-like quality of the models, Mantegna also made palpable, and he made the viewer realize, the conversion of one media into another, sculpture into print. And in doing this, he also figured the historical distance between the source of his work and the work itself, allowing the viewer to see that there is a historical distance between Mantegna's evocation of antiquity and antiquity. And so, again, we can really see this lapidary quality. And again, so what is important to realize is that I think Dürer was also interested in kind of conveying this historical distance. And so, but whereas Mantegna really instilled this distance into his line and instilled this distance into his own kind of graphic style, Dürer also found a new way to instill this distance. And I would argue that there were two ways in which he did this. And one of the most important ways in which he did this is he dated the drawing. And again, as we can see, Dürer was really interested in dates. And so, whereas Mantegna included a dedication to Christ in the drawing, Dürer instead put his initials right here, AD, and the date 1521. So whereas Mantegna oriented his work towards Christ, Dürer positioned his drawing as departing from one particular date and artist. So instead of orienting the work around Christ, he really oriented it around his signature and the date 1521. And we can also see that what's unusual, again, is we have, again, this horizontal orientation in the Oblong Passion, which, again, I would argue that the horizontal angle is also important. In many ways, it makes it into a paper sarcophagus so that the paper achieves really this kind of horizontal quality of the sarcophagus, which literally translates into flesh eating. And this was something that people would also discuss in terms of Mantegna's engraving, that the lines of the plate wear away, and so there's a way in which the wearing away of the plate lines kind of mirrors this wearing away of the flesh within the sarcophagus. So really both of these renditions, both Mantegna and Dürer's renditions of Christ's Passion explicitly engaged with the central tenet, which is the promise of redemption through Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. But Dürer, working in the wake of Luther's writings on the Passion, thinks about this a little differently than Mantegna. And so whereas previously people thought that one could kind of atone through acts of prayer and indulgences, Luther really argued that it was only in Christ and a longing for him that one could be redeemed. And we can see this again here, this kind of Lutheran interpretation in this Last Supper drawing that Dürer did. And it's the only drawing from this Oblong Passion series that was translated into a woodcut right here. And again, quoting Panofsky, he pointed out that in this woodcut, Dürer pictured a very unusual moment in the Last Supper. So he depicts the moment actually after Judas leaves, and he depicts the moment in which Christ is bestowing a new commandment. And the new commandment is, wherever I go, you cannot come. And so I give to you a new commandment, and that commandment is that you love one another as I have loved you. And by this, all men should know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And Simon Peter said to the Lord, where are you going? And Jesus answered to him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterwards. And many scholars have noticed that the sacrificial lamb is absent from the charger in the foreground, and that this absence speaks to Dürer's alignment with Luther on the Last Supper as something that is commemorating the promise of redemption as opposed to sacrifice, as opposed to having kind of a slaughtered lamb there. So in this way, this Last Supper too is positioning itself towards the contract with Christ. Yet whereas Mantegna, again, really positions his work towards Christ, Dürer is speaking to the absence of Christ, and he's speaking about what is left in his absence, which is the Christian community. And in his rendition of the Last Supper, he imagines the apostles sitting with their beloved, struggling to grapple with his impending absence. And it's the moment at which Christ says, love one another as I have loved you. And so when Dürer depicted Christ's passion at the end of his life, he represented this distance between himself and Christ with a certain new aesthetic of line. But it was not only a meditation on theological or also metaphysical distance, but it was also really a meditation, I would argue, on mundane and historical distance, not only thinking about the distance between him and Christ, but also the distance between himself and Mantegna, or himself and Roger van der Weyden, or Martin Schongauer. And in many ways, this ability to think about distance and caring was a lesson that he learned from meditating on works like Mantegna's, carrying Christ's body to his tomb, a work itself that is a meditation on antiquity and antique fragments and geology. And so, although Mantegna's work embodied what was thought of as a, quote, hard and stiff style, it was in this adherence to the hardness of marble that Mantegna really made clear his debt to antique statuary. And so in turn, in his particular deployment of Mantegna's austere line, Dürer is really making palpable his debt to the Italian's engravings, and he's really memorializing the traces of images, bodies, and artists who are working in the wake of Christ's absence. And so whereas Mantegna really oriented his engraving towards Christ, Dürer is really describing his distance from Christ with the date and his own initials. And in marking this distance, he articulates the space of the landscape in which a new history of images traverse, a new history of images that will become what we think of as the history of art. Now, there is an epilogue to this story. And here we see a really beautifully rendered copy of John the Evangelist from a Dürer engraving by the artist Abu al-Hassan, an artist who lived after Dürer. So he lived from about 1589 to 1630. Dürer died in 1529. And this artist worked at the court of Jahangir in Delhi as a Mughal miniature painter. And so here we can see how already within this period, Dürer's engravings are traveling around the world and influencing artists. Yet in Abu al-Hassan's specific rendition, the figural study has been removed from the context of the Passion and the specificity of John's grief at the death of Christ. And instead, it really becomes a study, it becomes a figural study, it becomes a study in thought and solemnity, but it also becomes detached from its specific Christological context. And so, in a very different vein, but another important engagement with Dürer's graphic language occurs in the work of the contemporary artist, Eric Avery, who directly cites Dürer's very famous Adam and Eve composition to create a visual vocabulary by which to grapple with the AIDS crisis. So whereas Dürer's print presents Adam and Eve at the moment of the fall, before their expulsion from the Garden of Eden, Avery really resituates Adam and Eve after the fall, with the snake of temptation held limp and lifeless in Eve's hands, and their bodies separated by the divide of the quaking earth. And so no longer is this a model of anatomical harmony or perfection. It now becomes a study in how things fall apart and how bodies become diseased. So both of these artists are really working far beyond the imagined Christian community that structured Dürer's own practice. And he really was quite an advocate of this community. At the end of his life, he had very strong words about kind of global conversion. So in their very different ways, both the artists Abu al-Hassan and Eric Avery convert Dürer's work, demonstrating how form can figure an embodied knowledge that Mantegna recognized as the highest achievement for an artist, and that really the ability for an artist's work not to stay the same, but to possess a knowledge that was capable of constantly being converted, transformed, and reimagined, and extending into higher levels of form, that this is really the true goal. And I think we can really see this here in these later artists' adaptations of and thinking through of Dürer's work. And so it's important to keep in mind about Dürer is that as brilliant as he was, he also very much belonged to his own century. I think if he was to time travel to today, he would probably be fairly unlikable by most liberal standards. He was most likely against a very important peasant rebellion. He had very questioning kind of positions on otherness and other people. And yet he was very much a man of his own century, and he had his own particular perspective. And he also really canonized this perspective within his own signature and his own date. And so in this way, as an artist, as all artists do, Dürer really remained limited by his own biases, his own devotion to Luther, and his own historical moment. Yet what he recognized was that his work could move beyond him. And so just as Christ told his disciples at the Last Supper that he would journey to a place that they could not come, leaving them behind in a community defined by faith, so Dürer really thought about the community of fellow artists that surrounded his own present moment. And so therefore, at the end of his life, and thinking through the Passion, Dürer really embraced, I would argue, the ways in which artists will forever remain bound to their own temporal moments. And the only way that one has to extend beyond that temporal moment is through an engagement with one's artistic predecessors. And through this engagement with the historical past and the recognition of the distance between oneself and one's historical past, a window also opens onto the possibility that works of art will travel into new worlds, leaving their makers behind, explicating and speaking to new faiths, crises, losses, and modernities that remain beyond the creative vision of their original maker. And it is when these images are let go from their makers and they are let go from the hands of the artist, and that they become set en route by later artists. And it is only by realizing this journey and being set into journey that they realize their potential and final form. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer any questions, if there are any questions. I don't know if there are. Or if you're feeling shy, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. I can hang around for a few minutes. All right, we look pretty good. Well, thank you very much for coming, and I wish you all a lovely rest of your Sunday.